Let's take the handout that you have on Luke chapter 7. Before we get into our prayer time, take a look at this. Anybody need the handout? Anybody need one? All right. Okay. Now, we're just looking at verses 11 through 17, and I've summed up all of those verses in one statement at the top under Luke 7. Here's the essence of it. Without anyone asking, without anyone showing faith, because of his compassion, Jesus takes the initiative and raises back to life a widow's only son in order to answer the people's question, who is this man? Now, in Luke's gospel, that question is asked. In Luke's gospel, that is the main question. Who is Jesus? Well, Jesus is going to answer that question with his words and with his deeds. He's going to say things that only God says. He's going to do things that only God can do. And in this passage, he's going to raise a dead person back to life. Who but a divine person can do that? All right, so look at verse 11. And it happened. Now let's pause right there. Not accidentally, but providentially. God is going to bring Jesus and this widow to cross paths at a certain place at a certain time. So it happened soon afterwards that he went to a town called Nain. Nain means F-A-I-R, fair. And it was called that because of the beautiful scenic place where it is set. And his disciples were traveling with him, accompanied by a considerable crowd. Now, verse 12 turns from focusing on Christ to a woman, a female. 8 different times reference is made to this woman. I want to point it out. Look in verse 12 at the dark italic words in the second line of verse 12, mother. His mothers, and the word she, and the word widow, and the last word in verse 12, her. Look at verse 13, her, a second her, a third her. Look at verse 15, the last word, mother. So the focus here is on a certain woman. All right, so verse 12. Now when he drew near the town's gate, look. Now that word look is written there on the writer's part for our benefit. You weren't there, I wasn't there. This is coming from an eyewitness who was there, and the word look is the writer's attempt to say, visualize this happening. You weren't there, and so here comes a funeral procession out of the city's gate. They're going to the cemetery to bury this dead person. Here comes Jesus into the gate with his disciples, and by the providence of God, the two are caused to cross paths. Look, a dead man was being carried out, his mother's only son, and she was a widow. Now, she's been through this before. We don't know how much earlier, probably years earlier, she had held a funeral, her husband's funeral. Now, she's a widow. This is her only son. How were women back then supported when their husband died or abandoned them? How were they supported? No Social Security.
Were they supported by family, friends, or they had their own support?
Usually they were supported by an older son or older son. Now, she doesn't have any support. Her husband's dead. Her son is dead. She's in a bind. And a sizable town crowd was with her. Now, she probably thinks, I wouldn't be surprised if this woman thinks, God's on the other side of the earth. I've fallen through the cracks. He doesn't see me. But look at what verse 13 says. And when the Lord saw her, he first began to look at this woman when she was conceived in her mother's womb. And he has never once taken his eyes off her. And when the Lord saw her, he felt compassion for her. Now, this is an amazing passage. this is coming right after the centurion whose servant was about to die. About to die. He wasn't dead yet. And the centurion sent a servant, and through the servant said to Jesus, please help. My servant's about to die. You don't need to come to my house to do it. In fact, I'm not good enough that you should come under my roof. Just speak the word. Because of your authority, because of your power, for where you are, despite the intervening miles, my servant will be healed. And he was. Jesus spoke the word. But here, nobody speaks to Jesus and asks for help. That centurion soldier was about to die. There was still hope. So when a person is in bad health, there's hope. When he's not yet dead, there's hope. When he's dead, what can be done? So nobody's going to speak to Jesus. His motive is that word compassion. He felt compassion for her, and he said to her, stop weeping. Now that's a prohibitive imperative in Greek, which means she was in the process of shedding tears, and Jesus is asking her, please cut it out. You don't need to weep. Now, and nobody's going to speak to the deceased. What do you say to a dead man? There's no reason to talk to him. He can't hear. But in verse 14, Jesus is going to speak to him. And coming forward, he touched the bear. Now, bear is not really a coffin. It's translated coffin in a lot of English translations. But the bear is a plank of wood with slightly raised edges on both sides so the corpse doesn't fall off. It's basically an open coffin, but it's not really a coffin. It's what poor people used. And coming forward, he touched the coffin, and those bearing it stood still. Now, those pallbearers, when they saw him touch it, that signaled to them he wants to do something, so they appropriately stopped. Now, look at what Jesus says. Young man, to you. Now, I want you to know in Greek, the words to you are very emphatic. They're taken from the proper place in the sentence and put in an improper place, as if to say, young man, I'm speaking to you and nobody else. To you, I command, arise. Verse 15, and the dead man sat up. Now, I'm amused at the way this verse reads. How does a dead man sit up? The dead man sat up and began to talk. How does a dead person talk? Well, this dead person has been brought back to life. Now, this is a figure of speech, and I can't remember the name of it. The figure of speech is when you keep calling a person something that it used to be dead, but it no longer is. It's found, for example, in Hebrews 11 when it talks about Rahab the harlot. Okay, she was once a prostitute, but she repented of her sin, God accepted her, and she's no longer a prostitute. But they keep calling her that. That's a figure of speech. And so I'm just amused at the language here. The dead man sat up and began to talk. They usually, when dead, don't act this way. But there's something unusual here. This dead man has been brought back to life. The result, verse 16, and reverent awe. Oh, no, I'm sorry, 15, I'll skip that. And the dead man stood up and began to talk, and he, Jesus, gave him back to his mother. I want you to look at that word give, gave. That word is didomi in Greek, and it's used of God giving wonderful gifts to people. Do you think that this widow viewed her son being brought back to life as a wonderful gift? Yeah. Oh, couldn't be any better. There's one thing this woman could wish. Here it is. My son is restored. It's a huge gift. Verse 16, here's the result. And reverent awe seized all, so that they began praising God, exclaiming, an outstanding prophet. Now see, the question is being answered. Who is this man? People are asking. And reverent awe seized all, so that they began praising God, exclaiming, an outstanding prophet. Now, the Greek is it's interesting. A prophet has been raised up. That is what happened to this deceased man. He was raised up. The word here comes from agero. This man was ageroed. He was raised up from death. And now this word's used of Jesus. A prophet has been raised up, agero, that is, appeared among us. And God has visited his people. Like Hebrews 2:6. What is man that you care for him? Or man's offspring, or man's son, that you visit him. What does that mean? When our children need a visit from God, he pays them one. And the Greek word translated visit is used in secular Greek of a physician visiting a sick man at home in order to help him. So our children from time to time need a visit from God. And God paid this dead man a visit. Verse 17, and this report about him spread into all Judea and all the surrounding region. Now the question in verse 17 is the word him. To whom does him refer? Does that him refer to Jesus? Or does the him refer to the deceased boy? I tend to think it's both. There's a lot of news going around that this dead boy has been brought back to life. Well, who did it? This man named Jesus did it. Now, I want you to turn on look back and look at some applications here. Number one, God cares for females as much as for males. In this passage, the focus is on a woman, not on her deceased son. Strange as that is. Remember all those words? Widow, mother, her. 8 different times the stress falls on this particular female. A woman is as precious to the Creator as is a man. 2, the encounter between Jesus and the widow was providential, not a coincidence. He arrived at the city gate just as she and a funeral were exiting the gate, having crossed their paths at just the right place, right time, under the right circumstances. 3, the widow had earlier attended a funeral, that of her husband. She may well have thought that God was unaware of her, but his eyes were elsewhere. Actually, the Lord saw her. According to verse 13, Jesus' eyes had been on her ever since she was conceived in the womb. He had never once taken his eyes off her. 4, nobody asked Jesus to do anything. He took the initiative to ask, and his motivation was his compassion over her grief. 5, nobody asked Jesus to speak to the deceased young man. What does one say to a dead person? They cannot hear us. Jesus spoke to him. The deceased heard him and responded. On Resurrection Day, we'll hear the voice of the Son of God. 6, death had severed the mother's relationship with a boy. Jesus gave a great gift to his mother, namely, he restored that severed relationship with a boy. 7, the common people correctly interpreted what they saw. God had visited their city. Again, that verse, Hebrews 2:6. What is man's son? Man's offspring that you visit him. That is, visit to help. 8, Jesus did not get the glory for what he did. God was honored for it. That was okay with Jesus, for he came to point folks to God. We too should not seek honor from others, but rather seek to point others to God so that they honor him. 9, the mother's deed. Something's not right here. The mother's, what's that? Oh, deep. Okay, thank you. I misspelled it. It should be D-E-E-P. The mother's deep grief brought Christ's compassion to raise her son. Moms exert an enormous influence on their children. You're familiar with the statement, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. Okay, so number 10, let's consider briefly some motherly influence on their sons. How about Bonaparte Napoleon? Now, what did he do, folks, that he's famous for? What did he do? Conquered. He set out to conquer the world. He conquered a large part of Europe and went into Russia to conquer that. And what kept him from conquering Russia? Cold. Adolf Hitler made the same mistake. And one of the greatest accomplishments of Bonaparte Napoleon is he went into Egypt to conquer that. And while he was there, the army was there, the British Navy took advantage of it and sunk all their ships so Napoleon's army could not get back to France. So what does he do? No ships. That didn't bother him. He just had his troops line up and march over the mountains back to France. That was a huge accomplishment. But where did Napoleon get his passion to conquer the world from? His mother. She told him, "You are a great ruler. And if you want to, son, you can conquer the earth." So he set out to do it, and he conquered a large part of it. B, General Douglas MacArthur's mother. Now, I want you to know that Douglas MacArthur, now remember he was a famous American general in World War II and in the Korean War. Douglas MacArthur, his father won the Medal of Honor as a soldier in the Civil War. And so MacArthur's mother said to him, "Your dad was a great soldier, but you can be greater than he was." And when he enrolled in West Point Military Academy, New York, his mother moved next to the campus to make sure he didn't waste any of his time on chasing girls, to make sure he did his homework, to make sure that his uniforms were nice and neat and clean, make sure he focused on being a great soldier. Now, this is what historians tell us. Douglas MacArthur became the greatest soldier America has ever produced. Where did he get that drive and ambition from? Not his dad. That's what I would expect from his mother. Let's go to number C, Augustine's mother. Did you know that Augustine, except for the Apostle Paul, has had the greatest influence on Christianity than anybody else, except for the Apostle Paul? Now, what was Augustine like before his conversion? Anybody know?
He was living with a woman.
Oh, he was very immoral. He was living with a woman out of wedlock and fathered a child, an illegitimate child, through her. He was just eaten up with sexual passion. He didn't feel like he had any hope. And his mother, Monica, she prayed earnestly for him. And after he was converted, she told him, "My work on earth is finished," and 11 days later, she died. And somebody who knew her well, he said to her, "Heaven could not resist such prayers that came from you, accompanied by your intense weeping for your son's conversion." How about D, John Newton? Now, what's John Newton famous for?
Slave trade.
What's he famous for?
Amazing grace.
Amazing Grace, that's right. Now, what was John Newton like before conversion?
Slave trader.
Oh, he was a slave trader. In fact, you may not know this, but he was in the British Royal Navy. Now, they were strict. If you deserted, if you were guilty of mutiny, they hung you.
Yeah.
He ran away from the British Navy. Now, if the British Navy ever got their hands on him, they would have hung him. They just couldn't catch him. So he ran away. He quit the British Navy. He didn't like military life, and he went to Africa. And what did he do there? He sold slaves. And he fell so deep in sin, what happened to him? He became the slave of a black woman. He was deep in slavery. And he had one thing going for him: his mother. She prayed earnestly for John Newton until he was 8 years old, and she quit praying for him. And when she quit praying for him, she died. I guess she quit praying on earth for him when she went to heaven. She continued to pray for him. But God remembered that mother's prayers for 8 years. That's what he had going for him. And God didn't forget. And so now he runs away from his black master, and he's in a ship. And what happened to that ship? It was caught in a vicious storm at sea. And John Newton and all the sailors thought there was no hope. And they were up bailing water out. And John Newton shouted to the other sailors, unless God has mercy on us, we will all perish. Right there. When he got those words out of his mouth, he thought to himself, that is the first time in years that I've ever used the word G-O-D and didn't link it to a word of profanity. Unless God has mercy on us, we shall all perish. In other words, they didn't have any hope for surviving this storm, but God was there. God used that storm to awaken his guilty conscience. And after that storm was subdued, he thought about it. Had I drowned, I know I would have been in the depths of hell forever. That led to his conversion. Now, he went back to, I don't know how he wasn't hanged by the British Navy, but he went back to England, and what happened to him there?
Became a pastor.
He became a world-famous pastor. People from all over the world came to hear his sermons and get his advice.
And he wrote Amazing Grace.
Yeah, he did write Amazing Grace. How about E, Chris Yuan's mother? Now, how many of you know of Chris Yuan? Let me see your hand. Yeah, Chris Yuan, he was one of my students at Moody. Wow. But oh, what was he like before conversion? Evil, evil, evil. I mean, evil. And his mother was so distraught as his life of sin that she started the War Room. How many of you seen the movie, The War Room? Well, it comes from Chris Yuan's mother. Did you know that? And by the War Room, she cleaned out one room in her house and made that her prayer altar. She put scripture verses on it, and she would go in there, I don't know how many times a week, and did one thing in there, prayed earnestly for her son. Long story short, we got in trouble selling drugs and was put in a Georgia State penitentiary. It's wonderful to hear him tell this story about his conversion down there. And he thought prison life was just awful, and it is. And one day he's standing by a big garbage can that stunk. The prisoner put all their garbage in there, and he's standing there by it, and something catches his attention, and he picks it up, and it's a Bible. And he said, I decided I was going to take this Bible back to my cell and read it, not because I was interested in God. In fact, he told his mother. His mother prayed for him and pled with him to turn from sin and accept Christ. And he said, Mother, so help me, if you mention God to me one more time, I will never speak to you again. And so he said, I fished that Bible out of the garbage can, took it back to my cell, not because I was interested in God, to take up time. I had nothing but time on my hand and nothing to do. And I thought the Bible would help me kill time. Now, as he's reading Scripture, what happens? God speaks. God converts him. And he says, I can't remember the quote from the Old Testament. And Chris says, God used those words from an Old Testament prophet dated about 800 BC to convict me of my sin, and he turned to Christ. And so he began growing as a Christian while in prison, and he decided God was calling him to the ministry. And so he looked around for a place to go and train when he got out of prison. He heard about Moody, and so he applied to Moody. And whom did he get to be his references? When you apply to Moody, you've got to have people who know you write references. He got the prison chaplain and some inmates, fellow prisoners, to write references for him. And he came to Moody, and when I knew him, he was passionate about the Lord. He's even more passionate about the Lord now. He, humanly speaking, owes his conversion to his mother. How about F, Kathy Eccles' mother? Kathy, I remember you talking about your mother praying for your safety. Remember that? Your mom prayed for your safety, I think, when you were young. And you sort of, if I remember correctly, you sort of thought that was not necessary. That was a waste of time. She prayed that you wouldn't get raped. And then two men captured you, one with a pistol at your face, another with a knife at your neck, and they took you into a room to rape you. Well, God must have remembered your mother's prayers. And he thought, that mom prayed for this girl, and now I'm obligated to do something for her. So God pulled your bacon out of the fire. those two men got into an argument about which of them was going to rape you first. They got so heated with each other, you just sneaked out and locked the door behind them where they couldn't get out. And lo and behold, like I said, God remembered your mother's prayer. And then how about G, Chicago gang member's mother? Some time ago, there were 5 or 6 mothers in Chicago. Each had just lost a son killed in the gang wars in that city. And the mothers were crying uncontrollably, except one mother. She was weeping, calm and peaceful. Oh, that attracted the attention of the news reporter. So he walked over to her and said, these other mothers are crying uncontrollably. You're weeping, but you just seem so calm and peaceful. Why? And she said, I had prayed for years that God would get my boy out of this vicious gang that he's been running with. And God has answered my prayers. God took him home to rescue him. My boy is now free from this awful gang he's been running with. So God has different ways to answer his people's prayers. But my point here is, if we go back to Luke 7, here was a widow, a very needy woman, no husband, no support, weeping over her deceased young son, and her grief attracted the attention of Christ, who had compassion on her. Had Jesus not seen her, in a sense, he wouldn't be aware of her, but his eyes were on her, and his heart was for her, and it was her grief that prompted his compassion and brought life back to her lifeless son. She had a huge impact on her son. And my point here is, there's a lot of truth in that statement. The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. Mothers have had profound influences upon their sons and daughters. Okay, any questions or comments over this?